Well, thank you so much for being here, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm excited to talk about authenticity.
Yeah, me too. As we were just talking about, it's definitely one of the more unique conversations we've had on the podcast, diving into like journalism and politics and your definition of it. And so excited to get in. Before we do that, though, I'd love for you to just tell us, tell people who you are and sort of what part of your journey you're comfortable sharing.
Okay, sure. So my name is Kevin McSpadden. I'm a journalist who's been in the industry for coming up on like 11 years or so, over a decade. Starting to officially become a veteran, which is a nice way of saying old. So I I got into journalism right after college. I was a millennial who graduated into the kind of recession era, economic recession era. So I, right after college, was kind of working at restaurants. I worked at a preschool for a little while, but I always thought I wanted to be in journalism. I think that's because I was politically opinionated, especially about, I was living in Oakland at the time, so especially about some local Oakland issues, and I thought journalism would be a way to get into it. But when I started applying for jobs when I was 22, 23, I guess at that point, I harshly realized I just wasn't good enough. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had a kind of an idea that I would be like a waiter during the day and a journalist at night, some romantic notion. And that just wasn't going to happen. So I applied to a bunch of journalism schools and I got into this one in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong. And just, it was the best school I got into by a long shot. And it was kind of an opportunity to like take a pretty massive risk and move. I didn't know anything about Asia at that point. I have a history degree, but my history focus was on Latin America and kind of American history, and I really didn't know anything about Asia. But I took a leap of faith and I went to school there for a year and built a 10-year career in Hong Kong and Singapore. And yeah, I lived there for over a decade and moved back during the pandemic because of I just was too far away from my family during the pandemic and it wasn't really sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. 10 years in Asia.
Yeah, it was so I've covered some pretty big, I don't know if you remember like the Hong Kong protest movement. That was probably the core of my career because I got my it's always weird in journalism because sometimes you get career bumps by like bad things happening, and it's this kind of weird ethical issue. I when I was in school, I had a lot of Nepali friends, and they had moved back to Nepal after graduating because they were on this kind of like program, so they kind of had to move back. And also, I'm going to apologize for my dog
Oh, you can't
if he
hear. It's
shows
all
up in
good.
the
And I
audio.
also love a dog, so no worries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, and so they had like a major earthquake there like a year after graduating. And I was talking to a few of them and they were just like, this is so weird because I've made more money in the last like 2 weeks than in like 5 years, but I kind of feel bad doing it because it's
Yeah.
like an earthquake. And
Yeah.
so I had some of the same issues with the Hong Kong protest movement where I got there right before the 2014 one, which was when the people kind of occupied the whole city, and then um, covered tech in Singapore for a while, but then moved back to Hong Kong when the really big one blew up because I had experience there and kind of got hired, honestly, because they needed bodies to help cover that event. And I was mostly editing my local colleagues who were on the ground reporting, and it was fascinating, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so you're out there and the pandemic happens and you decide to
Yeah,
come home.
yeah. Um, so in Hong Kong, the pandemic rules were pretty strict.
Yeah.
So every time you left the city for a large chunk of the pandemic, you'd have to stay inside of a hotel room for 3 weeks.
Mhm.
And then for some of it, it was 2 weeks. I did it once, and it was quite that was an experience in itself. I don't think I could have done 3 weeks. 2 weeks was pushing it. It's weird. It's like it's a
Absolutely.
weird experience.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I have a friend who moved um during like the later half of like when we were getting out of quarantine, but she still had to quarantine when she got there. And I remember that being really intense for her.
yeah, it's strange. The first week is like you're really like motivated weirdly. You like work out 3 times a day, get
Oh
your
yeah.
work
Oh
done.
yeah, I remember that part.
I think it was the NBA finals were going on at that point, so I just like dove into the NBA and was like really like knew all about it. And but then the second week there's like a because you just haven't left a room, the depressive stuff kind of kicks in and you like are sleeping for an hour at 4 p.m. randomly and you don't know why. And it's all just because you haven't left the room in 2 weeks.
Oh yeah. You talk
Um,
about the pandemic and like just the fact that we're all still carrying that, not talking about it, like it's a whole different podcast. I talk about that for like
oh yeah. I mean, that is
hours.
a whole different podcast, but I totally agree with
Yes.
you. I think we need a hopefully, no matter who gets elected, I'm kind of hopeful that in the next year or two, there's some sort of like there was a 9/11 commission report that came a few years after 9/11, and I think that was really cathartic. And I think
Mhm.
there should be a pandemic report similar where someone just dives in and just tries to do this, the most straight-laced apolitical report on what happened and release it. Because it's just, you're right, it's like it's a huge thing. It's like I don't think people they're just like, oh, it's over. It's like, yeah, but that was like a not a war, but like kind of.
Like internal like war. Like literally we all
Yeah,
was in our apartment, like by ourselves.
yeah. No,
And
it
I
should
kind of
be
yeah.
anyways.
No, it's interesting though that that like event and also where the country was politically in 2020 is when you kind of like re-entered the US and came back here. And so like
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, no, I was just gonna jump off of that. I think that's an interesting part when you live abroad is when negative things are happening in your home country, it's probably not harder than the people, actually going through it. Although the pandemic was global, so you did kind of have like, oh, I'm also going through it. Um, but you do kind of like it ratchets up the homesickness a little bit. It's weird. Like, and if instead of thinking, oh, I'm glad I'm here and safe from the, political disagreements or the, chaos of the pandemic, you actually weirdly are like, I kind of wish I was there. It feels like I'm far away, and like the kind of yearning increases almost more than you would think. You might think you're like that you're glad you're not there, but in some ways you're actually like wish you were there instead of far away. It's a weird dichotomy. And that was just my experience. Maybe that's not true for everyone.
No, no, I think everyone has a different like, expat experience, but I think for you, especially as a journalist, having that like extra layer of like, I would guess that the way that you approach your career, your job, like affects how you see the world. And so
Hmm.
you'd be so, where you are. Like I think there are people, just in their regular lives who travel and they're, still hooked up with their friends and whatever, and they're still invested, but like your job was to be very invested in where you were. And
Hmm.
to come back here, like I'm wondering like how your time abroad as a journalist abroad like shifted your view of like American journalism and the way that we cover politics and the way that we of course think that we're the most important part of this spinning orbit of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, sorry, I'm just taking a moment to think about that really quick.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, so first and foremost is I like America. I should probably get that out of just be blunt and just say it that
Sure,
way. So
sure. Yeah.
everyone, and not even just for listeners, I genuinely like America. Uh, so that was part of also like when you were just like leave for a while, you appreciate certain things about the country that that sometimes other people take for granted. But to answer your question on media and journalism, I think the main difference is Asian journalist is much more small fee conservative, not politically, but like how it approaches the job. And I, in some ways, appreciate that more. It's every now and then you do feel like places are pulling their punches, and that can be a little hard as a reporter, um, when you wish they were more aggressive. But I think in this kind of modern media environment that we have now, the the instinct of at least my career in Asia to like slow down for a second is actually really valuable, because it ends up creating reports and articles that are less opinionated, less kind of hair on fire, less kind of screaming from the top of a building, and more just passing along information, which I think is kind of the role of journalism, and I think is where the American media in general has gotten lost, is confusing punditry with journalism. I think and honestly, half of that is people, pundits on Twitter calling themselves journalists, and I'm a journalist, and 98% of the population doesn't go to journalism school. They don't care that much about this stuff. They're working in fashion, or they're working in construction, just because there's construction outside my house, right? They don't, they don't, they don't, they're not thinking about it as like the way I think about it, because this is my job, the way I don't think about construction, the way they think about it. And so much like they wouldn't expect me to go over there and know how to work a bandsaw, we shouldn't expect them to know how to distinguish between punditry and regular journalism. And I think right now what's happening is a lot of opinions are being promoted as news, and it's often really subtle, and stuff that you wouldn't really notice if you weren't looking for it, like using words like extraordinary or fantastical, or what's the, like, inevitable, or just like these adjectives that kind of throw an opinion in there without actually um, saying it's an opinion, I guess, for lack of a better
Yeah.
just to say it.
That's really interesting to think about, like as a writer and as someone who just like loves words, think about that little thing. Like I'm sort of thinking back through all of the news I've heard in the last couple of years and like those adjectives. Like you don't realize
Hmm.
how much you've heard something until like someone pointed out. It's like all my friends and I joke, and I think the world is joking about like unprecedented times. And like I would love to go back to living in some precedented times, honestly.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
how that word has come through. But it's really interesting with the idea of opinions, and like I haven't really parsed out the idea of opinions and authenticity, but they're certainly related. And
Hmm.
you're at the beginning of your journalism journey, and when you're, having opinions about politics, thinking about that and your local politics, to where you are now and thinking about and having learned, it seems like the fact that good journalism, it sounds like you think is devoid of like the opinion. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where people on both sides of a certain issue get frustrated with journalists. I have um not to bring up, well, I guess to bring up a pretty sensitive issue. I have my cousin and his partner are pretty like active in the like in the Gaza, support Gaza movement in New York. They're kind of activists, for lack of a better word. And they get frustrated with me because because of because of my unwillingness to kind of go as far as they go, even though like personally my politics agree with them, but my job sort of prevents me from going with them. And if I went with them, then I wouldn't really be a journalist anymore, which is fine. And honestly, like a lot of journalists, especially in their 20s, will get into journalism and then sort of realize that one of the problems with journalism is you can create change by like unearthing information, but when there's something as big and obvious as like the war in Ukraine or war in Gaza, or COVID, there's like a limited amount of change that you can actually make as a journalist, because you're literally just passing information on to other people and they do it with it will. And a lot of people leave the industry because they want to become activists, or they want to if you're a business journalist, you get sick of reporting on businesses and you're like, I just want to start my own business. Like I'm sick of reacting to everything. I want to like do it. And that's actually a really common trend where people will work in journalism for a decade or so. And then part of me wishes I could, join my cousin and his partner on their journey. But if I did, I would be leaving my career behind, which, that would be a pretty major decision that I would be wanting to, if I did that, I wouldn't call myself a journalist anymore. I'd be an activist.
No, absolutely. And I think I'm hearing like the internal, I'm so like, grateful like you're talking about the internal like kind of line that you have to like straddle and walk, where you like,
Hmm.
clearly like do have personal opinions and do have like takes you're a human being, but the idea of like I can't like turn my opinions into the news that I'm bringing along. It's like to
Yeah.
like really like radically simplify it. It's like if you see like I don't know, a fire, and then you report it as like, well, I think they started the fire. And that's not news anymore, because all you saw was the fire.
Yeah.
And so,
Yep.
yeah, I wonder like how you like walk that line and like think about like I'm because I'm throwing a little question here. I'm just thinking it's hard to not share your opinion sometimes, and like with your family and with friends in a political climate like this, it's really, yeah. I'm just not really a question. It's just I'm thinking about how hard that would be for me.
Yeah. I mean, I'll obviously share like my opinion with my, around the kitchen
Right,
table and stuff like
right.
that. But yeah, like in terms of like publicly,
Mhm.
no, it's well then, because like oftentimes opinions are wrong, like quite frequently. And it's important to, if I share my opinion on something like publicly in a journalism mode and then I'm just completely wrong, then it's like, what's the point?
Well, yeah, because then there's the idea of different kinds of opinions. Like if I think this is what happened, I could be wrong. But if
Hmm.
this thing happened and I think that it's wrong, then like that's a different kind of opinion, right? So like if we both
Yeah.
know that the fire began, and I think the fire, I don't know why I've decided the fire as a metaphor I'm using
Yeah.
today.
No.
Like if I decide the fire actually needed to happen and you are like, well, I don't think it should have happened, then in that situation, like neither of us is technically wrong.
No. And you've just kind of, you're just now in the opinion section of a newspaper, which is also totally fine. It's just
Right.
these lines have become blurred now, especially with how news is delivered via social media and just the internet in general.
Mhm.
You, if you're scrolling on your feed, so one thing I like about old newspapers, like the broadsheets, is they would separate the opinion section, and
Right.
you could kind of dive into the opinion section if you wanted to, but you knew you were getting into an opinion section, and so you're reading it as opinions. And then the rest was like the best version of facts that they could find. It is always the rough draft of, they call journalism the rough draft of history, because usually it's not fully correct just because it's the fastest version of events. Um,
Yeah,
So
which is where that idea of the slower speed in Asia you brought up comes, where it's like you can get a little bit closer to that version of fact. Is that
yeah, I mean, you're still limited because it is you're trying to, like the fire, right? You're the day of the fire, you don't know what started the fire, you don't know why it was started, but then 3 weeks later you might have that information, and that is released in a you know a official report, and that's probably more accurate.
Mhm.
But that's fine. That's not that big of a deal. That's how it's always been. Um,
Yeah, and thinking back to that idea with I forgot the word you used with the different kinds of reports and like the idea of like looking back at history and looking back at what happened during COVID, like we did with 9/11, like this thing happened and the fire is, over, depending on how you view the pandemic and quarantine and the, raging numbers. I'm not a journalist, I can say that, but it's like in my head now, I'm thinking about the idea of journalism and news as like a ever like evolving commitment to like the
mm,
fact that fact is not this like changing thing as the world changes and happens.
yeah, and one of the disconnects between media and the general public during the pandemic was that scientists were, because this virus was brand new and nobody knew anything about it, scientists were learning on the fly, and journalists were trying to report their learnings on the fly, but that often meant that I hesitate to say wrong information because it wasn't necessarily wrong, but it was just their best approach to the problem at the time, which then, as things developed, turned out to be incorrect. But then the general public kind of became resentful about that and sort of started to kind of react with anger, honestly, at those reports that I guess were wrong, but like wrong in the sense of like you're like trying to build a plane while it's flying, and you don't quite understand what's happening and how to handle these things. And it's why now, 3, 4 years later, um, we have a better handle on things. It's just time and patience, and now it's much more accurate in how we handle, COVID surges and vaccine deployment and opinions about that kind of stuff. It's the temperature has cooled quite a bit because people understand it better, and that just takes patience. It just takes time. There's no other
We
like
have so
solution.
little, we have so little of that. So we have so
Yeah.
little of that. It's like we all should like, I don't know, like work on our meditation and our news and our all that that I'm always working on. But getting into so we're talking about all these big events and journalism, and I've like could talk about all of those things in so many different ways. But thinking about the other kinds of things going on in the world. And
Hmm.
your newsletter, A6, I would love
Hmm.
for you to tell everyone a little bit about that. And like you describe it as a newsletter on Substack, where, I don't have a thing too. A newsletter showcasing stories that are a bit harder to find, but matter a great deal more, which I think is
Yeah.
intriguing. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for the opportunity to plug my newsletter. I totally forgot in the beginning
No,
when
of
I was
course. No, yeah.
introducing myself. Yeah. So it's called A6, Where the World Happens. So the name A6 kind of helps describe this newsletter, which is, if you think back, like I said, the old newspapers, there was always the front pages, and then, where all the big news was, and you'd have page two, which is a little bit more humorous. And when you kind of flipped a few pages and you get into A6, that's where you would start to get into some of the more niche news updates, like company buys another company, or governor of Minnesota, signs some bill. And those things don't deserve to be on the front page, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. And in some ways, they're more important because it kind of shows how the world is moving outside of like these big events. And because the world moves regardless of whether or not the media stops to like look at it. So, like right now is a good example. There's this huge, scary hurricane hitting Florida, and all of the media is rightfully focused on it. But just because they kind of shifted their coverage to that doesn't mean Austin, Texas, we don't it's hasn't rained here in like 3 weeks. And so we're, doing economic stuff. We're still moving despite that happening over there. And so my newsletter is a little bit like that idea where I'm trying to showcase how the world keeps moving forward, regardless of generally what's happening in the US, but regardless of what's happening in the front pages. So like the way it's designed, I very rarely dedicate issues to like the Israel-Gaza conflict, the Ukraine war, or American politics, because those are so easy to find and keep up with that I'm trying to highlight problems and good and bad and good things that are happening in the world beyond these big things. So like the last issue I had was focused on Claudia Sheinbaum, the new president of Mexico, and kind of what she's doing. And, she's the first woman president of Mexico. It's a big deal. And they have big problems there to solve, and what she's doing to try to fix some of them. Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah. I remember even hearing about that like very briefly. And all of my saw it on Instagram. I saw it on Instagram, and some people were like, "This is great," and then some people, in Mexico were like, "Well, I have feelings about this, like women or not." And so, just even when we get a glimpse of what's going on somewhere else, like we don't have the full story. That's interesting.
mhm.
Yeah, but I think just the idea. I mean, so much there, like it's important that we're aware of how the world is moving, regardless of what's happening here. And also, like, it's important that we know things are happening, even if they're being widely covered.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
And
that,
like,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry. No, no, you go. You go.
No, I think it's just, it's really, it sounds so simplistic, but I think that sometimes in conversations, like, I have to think about, but also I think just people have to think about, like, the world is so much bigger than, like,
Hmm.
the onslaught of news that we're even taking on here. Like I think that a lot of people, I imagine, or myself at a for version of my life might say, "Oh, well, there's so much to keep up with, even just here. How am I going to think about even more stuff going on?" Like I think that the idea of like just the consumption of how we take in news, people might push back against of like, well, I don't have like the mental capacity to take in more news. But then to that, it's like, are we taking in the right kind of news? Is the volume like, is the quantity matching the quality, and all these different things? And like, what happens to our view of the world that we live in when we're not like aware of what's going on in
Yeah.
the corners of it?
I think if people genuinely want to like fix that problem, I would suggest the best strategy is to, and you don't have to like get a newspaper or magazine subscription. You can do this digital, but it would be to treat it like your grandfather treats it and sit down with your morning coffee when you wake up and like whatever newspaper you subscribe to, read it for an hour and then don't touch it for the rest of the day. And like I'm a journalist and I don't have my notifications on because I mean, I'm kind of bad about like
Yeah.
reading these things, but I don't need the input and the headline input, and that can be really like makes you feel like you're overwhelmed even though you're not really. And
And
if
what
you
is that
just
phrase? Sorry, what does that phrase mean to the headline input?
Oh, like you just get notifications of, and all it is just like, I guess it's not really a headline, but it's the notification headline of jet plane crashes in Ukraine, and then 20 minutes later there's a hurricane hitting Florida, and then 5 minutes later Trump says something weird, and then 2 minutes after that Kamala is being criticized from the right, and it's just so much information, and you're just overwhelmed. But it's actually not that much information. It's just kind of how it's coming at you. Um,
Yeah.
it's a bit like a friendship or like relationship, if someone's coming at you aggressively, your first instinct is to like kind of defend yourself a little bit. And even if what they're saying is right, and even if you're in the wrong, it's just that when someone comes after you a little bit aggressively, you get into defense. It's like natural. It's just the human reaction. And I think sometimes the way our phones are set up, it's just coming into us so aggressively that your instinct is almost to like turn it down, like shut it off, like go into defense mode. Whereas if you just take some time to engage with it in the morning or in the evening, you'll understand what's happening in the world, but then you can like just turn it off. Just don't touch it for 24 more hours. Uh, and then you can use that energy to focus on your whatever, your fashion projects, your Substack, and you can use the information you learn to try to make better decisions, especially if you're running a business or if you're in the stock market or if you're, doing something where this kind of information is important. Um, you can use the information to make better decisions, but it's not if you don't if you're not up to it 3 hours after it happens, it's fine. You can like be day to day, not hour to hour is totally okay. And I think that would help people like take in this information without feeling overwhelmed because it's not the world isn't more or less active than it was 50 years ago. It's really not. Like there's not more stuff happening than there was. I mean, like 50 years ago, there was a huge war in Vietnam and like the communist revolution in China, although that was longer than 50 years ago. But you get my point. Like that was 75 years ago. But these big events happened back then also. They've always been happening. It's just we now have these digital devices that amplify everything all at once. And you can just turn off your notifications and read your homepage in the morning or once a day. Read your homepage once a day, catch up with what's happening, and then turn it off for the rest of the day and focus on your passions like your art, your business, your whatever you're passionate about.
Yeah. No, and now I gotta have a different conversation, like another podcast about like the digital age and like the way that like news in our phones. And I was at a talk back for a play and people were talking about like social media and journalism and like how we consume through there, which I think is so like just the constant barrage. And I feel like there's this like these two sides where I think the world is kind of trying to convince us like what you're saying of like we should like not overwhelm ourselves and take a break and go to our passions, but at the same time when we return to it, I think there's also like within relationships and culture like there's almost this shaming from certain people of like, well, you didn't hear about this the minute that it happened, why weren't you upset?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
and there's
just
this
ignore
like
that.
yeah, and there's this kind of translation of like, if I don't know every single thing that's happening in this war, like in Palestine, in this situation, like, then I don't care for some reason. And I think that there's this other like thread of like the way we consume our news and the way that we show it, because then it's sort of like I'm not sharing every single thing that I read on my Instagram story. I don't care, apparently. Like that's
Hmm.
also really interesting. And we kind of like decide a lot about a person based on our perception of their news consumption, which is really like honestly a whole different like just I always leave with more questions than answers. Now I'm just like all these thought bubbles, but
Yeah.
I also want to shift into not shift. We're talking about it, authenticity, but like bringing the actual word authenticity into the room. I think we've talked a lot about it and around it, but like thinking about, I think we've talked about the role of authenticity, like in journalism a little bit, what it means to you in terms of like opinions still closely related, but thinking about like the role of authenticity in your work right now and like journalism as it relates, like, in this very, this is going to come out, before the election here where we are in the US. And
Hmm.
like in this very, heated political moment that we're in, like how does authenticity like relate to journalism and politics and the news and the debates and all of that right now for you?
Yeah, so excuse me.
Okay.
Somewhat ironically, this is a bit of a jaded opinion, but I think a lot of journalists would agree. But journalism, the infrastructure of journalism doesn't really reward authenticity, which is unfortunate, but kind of true. And that's not okay. It doesn't financially reward it. I'll say it specifically like that. The financially does not reward authenticity because during this election, there's actually like really, really good journalism being done all the time, every day. But it's usually by people you've never heard of and probably will never hear of unless you like really pay attention to their bylines when they're doing it. But they're reporting for like, WBZ, BZK, CBS in Omaha, and they're like the local journalists in San Francisco, and they're like even the bigger, national brand like Politico will have its like beat reporter team that they built 18 months ago that has been on the trail for, 18 months. And those people are really doing good work in terms of the day-to-day grinding, what's happening, um, where, big events that are happening. Like a really good example of this is it's kind of an intense example, but a good example is in the very in the moments after the assassination attempt on Trump, the reporting on that was excellent because that was a rally that Trump has had 60 times in the last 6 months. It's day-to-day beat reporting, grinding work, and it just so happened that at that specific rally, um, potential once in a generation event happened. He missed, so it's more like a crazy election of event. But the people that were there were the beat reporters. They weren't like the national big name pundits or social media stars or the influencers. And so they reported on it like real news, like a gunman has fired shots at the former president during a and so in the hours after what's happened, you got very straight, very accurate news. Then that event was so big, it got obviously, and it's important as it should, it got blown onto the national scale where people who make a lot more money than those beat reporters and are much, I can't even name the beat reporters, and I'm like in this industry, and but people that make a lot more money than them and are more famous and are borderline journalists or pundits or influencers grab what the beat reporters did and they start to twist it, for lack of a better word, for clicks, for engagement, for conversation, and it suddenly starts to lose kind of its value, not its value, but the accuracy and authenticity of it starts to fall away, and you start to get grifters who are coming in and using this to make political points, using this to make pretty obvious, like they did this is why they're dangerous, kind of statements. And that is, I think, kind of one of the problems with authenticity in journalism these days is the people that are making money are tend to be, I mean, I hate to use the word like so liberally, but tend to be grifting, and they tend to be taking advantage of certain situations to kind of rile things up in order to make money, honestly. Like it's that's kind of the harsh reality of it. And so again, this is sorry, it's just such a jaded opinion, but
Okay.
that beat reporting job that those reporters do is a tough job. It's day in, day out. They make about as much money as a teacher makes. They have to be away from their family for hours I mean, for days, weeks, months at a time. They're basically on call 24/7. It puts a lot of stress on personal relationships, that job. Um, and they do it for love of the game. And there's a little bit, obviously every journalist is a little ambitious. So you also do it because you're like, this will be fantastic for my career in the long run, and maybe I'll be able to get a nice gig where the hour's a little bit better and the pay is a little bit better, and this is me kind of paying my dues. But they also do it because they want to witness history and they want to follow Donald Trump on his campaign to try to become the next president. And they want to say, I saw it, I was there, I did it. And those are like the authentic type of journalists that I respect and that I try to seek out when I'm reading what's happening and what's going on. A good strategy, if anyone wants to discover that, is follow the Harris or the Trump campaign and figure out where they are, and go to the local newspaper there, because it'll be a big deal there, and those local reporters will be covering it well, in a local way. I'm from Bozeman, and Trump had a campaign rally in Bozeman, Montana, where I'm from, and I was reading the Bozeman Chronicle because it's my hometown, and I was interested in the ex-presidents coming to my hometown, and it was good reports. It was, from the right, how many people are coming to this event? What are people excited about? From the left, people are angry. Why are they angry that he's here? It was good. It was good political reporting.
Yeah, so much to
I
think.
hope that answered your question and not
No,
was just
no,
not
it
fun.
always, I think the questions are always jumping off point is discussion, right? And so you used the word grifter a while back, and like,
Yeah, I kind of hesitated to say that word,
okay.
but
And I don't want, yeah, I'm just, yeah, can you say more on that? Like, I'm
um,
curious. I think that, you know, yeah, it's interesting because we're getting into the idea of, this election and, the journalism of what's happening and what we also know to be true and the different, yeah. So it's just I'm curious about that word choice.
yeah, I think it's because there are a large amount of people in media, I won't say journalists because I kind of don't consider them journalists, who use information, and oftentimes they're not really reporting, they're kind of just reading the news and then commenting on the news. And they use that kind of information to push forward certain agendas. Uh, it's less, so a good example is it's less of a big deal than it was 4 to 8 years ago, but Breitbart news used to be like, just like, it's not that it's far right news, it's more that it's like twisted things, and it pushes things that aren't really true or accurate or fair, because it riles people up or gets clicks or gets engagement, which they then either sell advertising, or for the individuals, which is kind of how it is now with social media, it's how they generate their income. Um, there was a big story a few weeks ago about 3 or 4 guys who were kind of pretending to do journalism, but it was always kind of anti-US government, anti-Biden, which, whatever on your opinion on that, but they always, always, always were anti the US government, kind of no matter what. And it turned out that they were getting funded by Moscow. And these people one of them has 3 million followers on Twitter, and like, 1.5 million on YouTube. And his news and opinions are not reasonable or fair or authentic. They are funded by the Kremlin. And um that stuff happens, and it's just, it's an unfortunate part of the social media. Honestly, it's part of the social media stuff, honestly, is it's much easier to gain a following and get famous by kind of being outrageous. And if you're willing to do that, people will pay you to to do that, to push their certain agendas.
Yeah. Yeah. And even that word like outrageous, like I'm thinking now about like when the news itself is like not outrageous and when something is
Yeah.
made that way.
Well, and it's like another like so right now, not to use this tragedy as a like just to prove a point, but weather reporting for some reason has always been good. It's never really like climate change, I guess, makes some people mad, but like for some reason, weather reporting is stayed straight, it's normal, and people believe it. And they're like, a hurricane's coming, a hurricane's coming. And for some reason, that doesn't translate to political reporting. Business reporting is also like, it's not as good as weather reporting, but it's also pretty good. Like company A buys company B, that like just happens. It's not, the stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. The economy, the jobs report is just the jobs report. Um, and people believe those stories. You don't read someone with like the jobs report being like, oh, they're lying about this. Like no one does that. But once you get into political or social reporting, it suddenly gets hyper polarized and people just don't believe things and they don't trust it as much. And I mean, and half of that is the media's fault as well. It's not the reader's fault. Like this is a problem in media as well. Not trying to blame readers. Just
Yeah.
like the media has lost the trust for some reason. And I'm pretty cynical about its ability to regain that trust, but I also worry that those people that don't trust the media are turning more to YouTube and TikTok, which is just like, okay, you're learning from a bunch of influencers. Great. Like that's probably not a good thing. I guess shots fired at influencers a little bit, but I'll take heed if I need to for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess like in defense of some of the influencers, I'll play devil's advocate. And also I think that I think it's with a general distrust and a general kind of like I don't know, just like what the hell do we do here? I think that like there's something to be said to people doing the best they can to like figure out
Hmm.
what's going on in certain places. And like, I do think like from my side that if you're like taking in some from somewhere and figuring out like here's what something that happened, like, and you're getting that from like your favorite TikTok influencer, like maybe that's better than not knowing it all or like getting a completely saturated version somewhere else. And like I think that
Hmm.
yeah, I'm not like pro and all the like absolutely always on TikTok, but I do think there's something to be said for some people who are just like using that medium to reach people who might not be reached in other ways and to, you know,
Yeah. And
things.
just do a 5 minute look into this TikToker and see if
Right.
they're if they're being funded by the Harris campaign, then it's going to be pro Harris, and that's fine. It's just as long as you know that, it
Mhm.
just takes 5 minutes. You can just take their username, do some Googling. If it's like, oh, this person doesn't take money from anyone outside of, the
Your funds.
TikTok revenue, then
Right.
oh, that might be fair. But oh, this person takes money from the pro business lobby, then that they're going to be incentivized to be pro business, and that's not a bad thing. It's really not. It's just understanding where the information's coming from.
Interesting. Yeah. And so all that being said, like what is your like definition of authentic journalism?
I would say this is so lame, but just trying your hardest, man. It's like it's tough out there, and that's it sounds kitschy and silly, but the people that are wake up every day and are just trying their best to figure out what's happening and write reports and talk to a few people and put their best version of the truth out there, that's authentic journalism. And if they make a mistake every now and then, it's inevitable and they will feel worse about it than any other criticism you could give them. And so that's kind of what my version of authentic journalism is. Just going out there and trying your hardest from a fair, straight standpoint and doing it
Mhm.
for love of the game. And mistakes happen. It's just it's inevitable. But as long as you're not deliberately twisting things to suit some narrative.
Yeah, that idea of the best version of the truth keeps coming back to me. And the
That's
idea,
the idealist. That's the idealistic version.
yeah, yeah, but I think that there's also things we said there about authenticity of like there are versions of the truth. I think
Hmm.
that's like maybe the cynic of me, but like something
No,
happened.
they teach that exact stuff in journalism school, and that's why like a newspaper will have 25 journalists because it's literally impossible to pull all of your opinions out of something, like quite literally impossible. So
Yeah,
even like little decisions that you make about where to put a paragraph and all that kind of stuff are like
right.
micro opinions. And so
Yeah,
if you have 25 reporters all scurrying around doing something, then all of their opinions will sort of like mute each other out and you'll kind of end
mhm,
up with some version of what's hopefully accurate. And if
right.
you're wrong and you issue a correction and you apologize and you get screamed at by the public, which is, a
Yeah.
part of that's just
And
the
I right. And I wonder too if there's a case there for like, well, I do believe there's a case there for diversity of like opinion, but also like people in that
oh,
like
totally.
even if you and I are standing at the same place, like again back to the fire, or even like the rally, again going back to like Trump's like, the shooting. I think that it's like there's like that theory of like when we both see a color, like or like the schema of like if I say blue, then you can picture different blue than I picture blue. So it's just
Hmm.
like there's like how much can we be objective and like what how much authenticity like slips in sometimes, even like I think there are people who would even like argue like calling it like going back to the Trump thing, like assassination attempt. I think some people like look at that as an opinion. And so I think
Hmm.
that, yeah, it makes me think about like how much you have to distill and think about like really being very like critical thinking and just like really analyzing that. And I think the word choice thing also comes back again. So it's just like, to me, I think a really big takeaway from this conversation is just like also the critical thinking piece. Like even as simple as like looking up who its TikTok follower is, looking up like this broadcaster and just thinking about like making decisions for ourselves in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And if any industry needs diversity, it's journalism. It's like it's probably I wouldn't say the most important industry for diversity, but like it just requires the
Yeah.
fact that it wasn't diverse for so long is like kind of embarrassing. But
No,
like,
there's a lot of
oh,
embarrassment when it comes to lack of diversity, and that's a whole
but
different
in
conversation
terms
too.
of seeing
But,
things from like 18 different perspectives, it's really important to have those different diversities. And
right.
um,
And I
the
think, yeah,
industry in general needs to pay better so that way they can get people who might come from a poorer background and can actually survive off the salary and don't require, a safety net to live on $40,000 a year. That's not very much money. So if you want someone from a poorer background to add that perspective to your newsroom, you need to pay them so where they can survive off your salary.
oh yeah, and
It's
that's so many different future podcast topics coming up, like so many
yeah.
like pay inequity, pay gaps, all these things. But I think that, the more I think about it, I feel like the role of journalism in my mind is becoming like presenting people with the best version of the truth so that they can make informed, like, opinions and decisions. So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
in a
That's
way,
the goal.
like your job is to kind of be like, and I wouldn't even call the absence of authenticity here inauthentic. I think that the word inauthentic is a different connotation, but like be like, okay, I'm going to tell you, here's this fire. And then I get to read the news. And my job is not to just like have no opinion and be like, okay, and that's, whatever. It's to look at the facts in a way where like I'm gonna my authenticity, and it's not also gonna be conflated with yours. I'm gonna be able to make a decision, like, and I think in terms of decisions, like voting comes to mind very deeply, and that a lot of people are making kind of those decisions right now. But like the role of like convincing someone versus just like laying out the facts of things. And I
Hmm.
think that that also hopefully gives people something to think about in like discussions around politics and news, where I think that's a
Yeah.
whole different discussion as well, um, on how we can like respect authenticity and look at the facts in a different way and say like, hey, we're not arguing over the fact anymore. Like the fact is there was a fire, but what we're talking about is our reactions to it. And I think that I'm going
And
off.
that's the job for the public and the
Yes.
activists and the government and all that kind of stuff,
Right. And
not the
also,
journalists.
no, exactly. And the general like the sway of that and the compassion and respect and humanity that has to come from like difference of opinion has to be sort of distilled down to in like what is the opinion. Like if my opinion is so and so did this, like is that an opinion or is it a fact,
Hmm.
And like just that, I wonder if that could do something too, because yeah, as a person who's deeply invested in this election but also deeply invested in like the fabric of society regardless of the results, and I think about those things as well.
There's a good saying, and I'll just leave it here. I'll just do the saying. I didn't look it up before, so I sorry I can't attribute it, but it's basically the role of a journalist is if there's one side that says it's not raining and another side that says it's raining, your job is to go outside and see if it's raining.
Oh, I like that. I'm gonna write that down, or you'll send it to
Yeah.
me. I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. And I think that's a good place to like, yeah, I could say so much more. I think that's a good place to have it. And I love that we've gotten into the weather and the fires, and it's all very, very biblical. It's all very biblical we've gotten here. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I want to thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you for having me.
Oh my God, of course. It's just like any conversation where I'm left with more questions and more like just like not confused. I think confused is also a negative connotation, but just like I have a lot more to think about is a conversation that I like leaving. So I really appreciate that. And so I have this question I ask everybody, and I'm gonna put a spin on it for you for journalism in this workbook that I think you're aware of that I have authentic by Alexa. I have this question about authenticity accessories. And usually
Mm.
I'm like, if they made you've made it. Like they're making the Kevin McSpadden Barbie action figure or whatever, like what's in the box. But I'll put a spin out for you. Like it's like Kevin the journalist. So like what are your authenticity accessories that come in the box of your doll, like as a journalist? Like what has to be in there?
Oh my God. Um, what a question. My, I mean, I think the main one would be like, and it's a little symbolic, but it would be a little like voice recorder. Because I think that symbolizes like those old, like they're not even that old, but phones have replaced them now. You stick it in front of someone to record them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that sort of symbolizes the core mission of the job, which is to ask some questions to prompt the person to speak, but then to sit back and hold your recorder out, click record, and let them answer it to the best of their knowledge. So I think that would be my core accessory.
Okay, sounds good. And to ask like a slightly authentic leaning one, when you're like working on a big piece or like writing something, like do you have like a go-to like snack or like thing you have to have when you're writing or like a drink or like your like writer's history?
I found weirdly that this is probably not very healthy, but if I don't eat and drink tea and coffee, that tends to be the best way that it works for me. I think it keeps my energy up for some reason.
Okay.
It doesn't help in terms of like I get my little bit of authenticity right now is I basically every time I publish something, I just get consumed by anxiety that I totally messed up somehow and someone's gonna yell at me. even though it's been 10 or 11 years of doing this.
Yeah.
So the caffeine probably doesn't help with that, um, but yeah, I think everyone is in this job is like that, especially if it's something you've worked on for 2 weeks and it's like 3,000 words and you're like, and it's like big and important and you're like, oh my God, what if I click
Absolutely.
publish and everyone yells at me or
Oh, I
threatens to sue me or whatever.
oh, I get that on Substack like every day. And it's not even like truly. Like I think I have my new newsletter, as you know, New Yorker Goes West, and I have my other one, Wild Hoosie Free, which is like my bigger one. And I almost like that there are less subscribers on New Yorker Goes West. I'm like, oh, it's just like 15 people are gonna get this. Like that's like
Yeah.
it's super chill. Like they can't get that mad at me, but like the bigger it gets, it's like careful what you wish for. It's like I want everyone to read these things, but I'm like, I don't though. I kind of don't want
Yeah.
this ever. Uh,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much again, Kevin. I think this has been such a delight and so much to think about. And I'm just really grateful that I can give this conversation to our community and give people hopefully some fodder for their own interesting conversations to have. But
Yeah, I hope and generate some comments in the comment section and that,
yeah,
I'd love to read what people think about it.
yeah, well, I'll see you in the comment section.
Yeah, exactly.